Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the latest webinar in FRAC's COVID-19 series. Like Nomi mentioned, my name is Clarissa Hayes, and I'm a policy analyst here at FRAC. We just wanted to give a big thanks for everyone for joining us today. We know that you are all super busy, so we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So if this is your first time joining us for one of our webinars, welcome. We actually hold a after-school meals, back-to-school webinar every summer to highlight best practices and opportunities for increasing the reach of these really critical programs. But as we all know, things are looking very different this year. So as we begin to enter the new school year, schools are choosing between in-person instruction, virtual, and a variety of hybrid combinations in response to COVID-19. We know that this also means that after-school programs, which really provide an important foundation for snacks and meals to be served when the school day ends, will look different as well. So despite this, the after-school meal programs remain a really important opportunity to provide suppers and snacks to students all year, including on weekends, school breaks, and holidays. So on today's webinar, we are going to dive into what the programs are in case you are brand new to these programs. And then we are going to touch on additional things to consider based off the current pandemic and the current flexibilities that exist for the programs. I'm also excited to share that two of our partners, the Afterschool Alliance and the YMCA of the USA, will be joining us to share how after-school programs overall have adjusted over the last 5 months and have really stepped in to provide meals during this time, the important role that they play now, and what support is needed moving forward to make sure that they remain strong. So we know that partnerships and flexibility is going to be critical to expanding these nutrition programs. So we are excited about today's conversation. And again, we're very glad that you can join. So if you have any questions as we go through, feel free to add those to the Q&A function, and we will make sure that we get to those at the end of today's event. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at what we are going to cover today. So like I mentioned, I am going to kick us off by giving a rather brief program overview and then just a look at the current flexibilities that are available for the nutrition programs during this time and what we know is happening. Next, we're going to hear from Eric Peterson, who is the Senior Vice President of Policy at the Afterschool Alliance, who is going to talk about how the out-of-school time partners responded in the spring and how things are looking moving forward. And then we are going to turn it over to Stacy McDaniel, who is the Anti-Hunger Initiative Specialist at the YMCA of the USA, who is going to talk a little bit about how YMCAs have responded and what it's looking like moving into the school year. And then, of course, we will save time at the end for Q&A, so have those questions ready. We're looking forward to having that conversation. All right. So before I really dive in, I did want to give an opportunity to hear from you. We know that there's a wide range of partners on the call. So if you can, using the chat function on your screen that you should see at the bottom, if you can just share how will, and this is a two-part question, feel free to address it how you'd like, but how will your after-school program change if you were an after-school program, or how will your after-school meal service look different this school year? So we know that many people are, dealing with changes and adjustments to your program. So we're going to give you just 30 seconds to a minute, kind of share what you're seeing in your community and how you will be adapting as we know things continue to look different because of the current public health crisis. So feel free to add that to the chat box. I'd love to hear more and learn more about where you're from and what you're seeing in your community. So I'll give everybody a little time for that, and then we will move forward. All right, so just in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on, but if you still are responding, feel free to do that and just make sure that you make sure that it's going to everybody and not the host or to the panelists so everyone can see. We appreciate that. All right, next slide, please. Okay. So I always think that it's helpful to start with data and a look at the program so we can see where we are and where we need to go with these programs. So every year at FRAC, we do release a report on participation levels in the after-school meal programs, and we also do this for summer and for school breakfast. But what we found is that in 2018, during the month of October, 21.8 million children received a free or reduced price school lunch on an average day. And then we know that when you look at after-school suppers, which is under the after-school meal program, 1.3 million children received a supper during that same time. So this program does continue to see growth year over year. It is a relatively new program in the scheme of nutrition programs. It was only expanded nationally in 2010 through the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. So there's a lot of room to grow, but we are excited to see that the programs do continue to grow, although we know looking at these numbers that there is still quite a bit to go until every child who's getting a free or reduced price school lunch is also receiving a after school supper, because we are only reaching about 1 in 16 as of October 2018. And our new report looking at data in October 2019 will be coming out in October. So that's something to look forward to. So on the next slide, kind of keeping with this data conversation, I did want to just show this because I think that this is very telling of an opportunity that exists within these programs. So when you look at the after-school nutrition programs, generally there are kind of two components of it. So there's the CACFP side, which includes the after-school meal program, which you can serve suppers and snacks through, which I'll get into in a little bit. And then the other side is NSLP snacks, which has been an opportunity for many, many years. It's an option for schools to implement. So what we're seeing here is that although schools have the opportunity to switch over to CACFP and do suppers, many of them, so 23 million snacks were still being served, which means that they were not taking advantage of the opportunity to serve suppers. So I think that this is very telling, and it shows that a big opportunity is just making sure that those that are serving NSLP snacks move over to CACFP to take advantage of that opportunity to serve more meals to children who need them. All right, so next slide. Like I mentioned, we are going to quickly do an overview of this program. If you have any questions, feel free to add those. We did want to kind of give this look at the landscape of the programs and then dive into what we know is happening this current year. So just quickly, this program does operate through the Child and Adult Care Food Programs, or so CACFP, and then it does provide free meals and snacks to children 18 and under. So every day, a child is able to receive up to 1 meal and 1 snack a day. So that is something to keep in mind when you think about the meals that can be served. To be eligible to participate, a site does need to be in an attendance area of the school where at least 50% or more of the children are eligible for free or reduced price school meals. So the one difference that I would add, if you are familiar with summer food, is that you can use census data and school data and other sources of data for that program. But if you are interested in serving after-school meals and snacks, you are limited to just school data. So that is something to keep in mind. And then the last point that I'll make here is that this program does require that some kind of after-school enrichment or activity is available to students to participate in. And we'll touch on this a little bit more when we talk about what we're seeing currently. Next slide, please. All right, and I wanted to include this because I think this visual is really helpful when you think about how these programs operate. So like all of the federal nutrition programs, including school meals and summer food, USDA does administer and fund those on the national level. And then from there, there's a state agency in every state that administers the program and provides really critical training for sponsors to participate. So usually this is the Department of Education, although depending on your state, and it may be the Department of Agriculture or Department of Health, it just depends. And we do have a link at the end of the presentation with all of the state agency contacts if you are not familiar with who that is in your state. So from there, the sponsors, can you go back, please? Thank you. So the sponsors are the entities that enter into an agreement with their state agency to run the program. So this can include local governments, school districts, and nonprofits that can sponsor after-school meal sites. And these are the organizations that, handle the paperwork, they do the training, they enter into that agreement, and they also receive that reimbursement for every meal and snack served. So from there, sponsors work with sites, and sites are the physical locations where children receive meals during the after-school hours. So sites, if they are in an eligible area, can really be located wherever children are gathering. So schools, parks, rec centers, YMCAs, Boys and Girls Clubs, really, again, wherever children are congregating. And these sites work directly with their sponsor to receive those meals. And for the most part, they are in charge with tracking those meals and making sure that the meals are served properly. So if you are new to this program, we often recommend, as do state agencies, that if you are a program coming on board, it usually makes sense to start out as a site underneath another sponsor because you are, able to benefit from the programs and serve meals, but you don't have to jump into handling the administrative part of the program right away. And then, of course, at the end of this cycle are the children and the students that benefit from these really important after-school meals and snacks. So I wanted to provide that. And then moving forward, I just wanted to quickly flag that, like, again, with all of the federal nutrition programs, there is a meal pattern that programs must meet in order to participate. So meals and snacks are comprised of a milk, grain, protein, fruit, and vegetable. And then depending on if you're serving a meal or a snack, and again, you can do both at a time, it will depend on how many components are part of that. So for a supper, you do have to serve all of those components and then a second different serving of fruits and vegetables. And then for a snack, you have to provide 2 of the, 5 components listed above. So something that we see often with this, with the program is that many that are doing snacks are able to quickly and easily move over to doing suppers because, as you can tell from the previous slide, it really is just adding those 3 components. And many, and maybe Stacey will speak on this, we've seen the framing around a super snap, which basically meets the supper requirements, but it's made of 5 snack-like components. So we know, especially if a after-school program doesn't have the capacity to cook or do anything like that, having that super snack is the easy way to get that whole reimbursement without having to do as much. So quickly before moving on, I just kind of wanted to summarize why after-school meals. Why did we want to, talk about this program right now? So we know that because of COVID-19, food insecurity is rising in every state and every community. More families and more children are becoming eligible for free and reduced price meals. And this after-school meal program is critical to fighting that hunger and the after-school hours. We know that some schools serve lunch as early as 10:30, and then if kids are able to participate in after-school programs this year, they'll be there at 3, 4, and that's a long time between those 2. So it really does give them the nutrition they need to stay engaged and healthy. The next point that I would make is that this program really does help support overall operations for schools and meal sponsors and after-school programs. For after-school programs, if they were providing meals out of their pockets, they're able to reallocate that funding and use that for other costs. For schools, it allows them to draw down additional reimbursement with really few added logistics because they do have that experience running school meals already. And then all meals are served at the free rate, which this year is $3.51 for a supper, which is, 3.5 times as much as they get for a snack. So that's a selling point. And then I would just say, too, that this program is very flexible as far as timing and meal options and locations go. So you can serve the meal anytime during the program. Many actually see success with serving the supper right when kids get to the after-school program and then maybe serving the snack closer to when children go home. There is that flexibility to do that. And then meals can be hot or cold. I know that when you hear meal or supper, that sounds like it could be very time intensive, but again, it doesn't have to be a hot meal if that's not something your program has the capacity to do. All right, so I think I'll leave it here on this slide for now, and I wanted to kind of address what we're hearing and what we're seeing change for this upcoming school year. And I think, as has been the case for the last 5 months, things seem to be changing on a weekly basis. Many schools that were planning to reopen and be there in person are now being remote, or they're pushing back their start times. So we wanted to give you an update on what we know around waivers and then what this means for the after-school meal program specifically. So if you are not familiar, again, over the last 5 years, USDA has issued many waivers to make sure that schools and community sponsors can serve meals. So when schools had to close back in March, many of them shifted over to the summer food service program because that is the option that exists during unanticipated school closure. So that program became an option, and then along with that, there were many flexibilities around doing non-congregate meals, having parents and guardians pick up, being able to serve many days worth of meals at one point. So those were all options through the summer. And then recently, or I guess a month ago now, USDA did extend several waivers for the upcoming school year, just recognizing that things will continue to be the same as they were in the summer and the spring. So for the National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program, and the Child and Adult Care Food Program, the list of waivers here are still an option. So, and I will address after-school meals in just the next slide, but non-congregate meals, which means that if school is remote or staggered or hybrid, meals are able to go home with children. Meal service times, which allows that flexibility with the number and the time of meal service. Meal pattern flexibility, so if there is a disruption to the supply chain or anything like that, there is a little bit of flexibility in still getting reimbursed if the meal pattern is not met. Parents and guardians can pick up without the student being present. And then this is just a point for high schools, for school meals, there is some flexibility around not having to do offer versus serve. And then I would just add a couple things that aren't here, and we'll make sure that our tracker with the waivers is shared in the chat box, but there have been some waivers too around monitoring. So for CACFT, not having to do those on-site monitoring visits. And then we did get word earlier today that if schools have planned openings that begin in September, they can continue to use summer food up until school begins. So we know that some of the waivers end on August 31st, the school starts on September 15th. So USDA has said that summer food can be extended in that gap period, which is really important. So that is a look at what we're seeing for this upcoming school year. And I wanted to just spend some time on some things that we wanted to flag for you. So the first one is that there is the requirement that after school programs that are serving meals have to provide an enrichment or educational component. And this has to be available. It doesn't have to be tracked, but it has to be an option for all students. And this was something that was waived in the spring and then through the summer until June 30th. So we know that as of now, this waiver has not been extended. We do know that many state agencies are submitting their own waiver requests to have this waived, and I would highly recommend checking in with your state agency to see the status of that. So what that means is that although CACFT technically has this non-congregate waiver, there still is the requirement that an after-school enrichment activity is required. So we are hearing different things, that some states will be allowing, virtual programming to still count as this. We're hearing that some states are okaying having an activity workbook or something like that go home with students. So it is very different state to state, and I think everyone is still learning and seeing what will work underneath the USDA requirements. So we did want to flag this is something that is on our radar, and it's something that if you are doing after-school meals, you should check in with your state agency to see what kind of guidance or flexibilities they have around this, because we know that this is, a sticking point, especially as we hear after-school programs are not operating in the same fashion they have in the past. And then the other thing that I wanted to flag here is that in the spring, summer food and the seamless summer option was available when schools closed. And again, as of today, USDA has not extended this option, which means that, meals cannot be served to anybody in the community. They do have to be tracked by the student and by their associated student eligibility. So they're free, reduced price, paid unless they're a CEP school. So One thing that we know has come up is that in some situations, kids may not be at school learning, but they may be at like a YMCA or a Boys and Girls Club doing their virtual learning there. And those entities would not be able to do school meals unless they, work on a partnership with their local schools to be serving those meals. So there are a lot of things here in play, and we continue to track it. On the next slide, I'll just kind of mention some of the things that we have been doing. So there is ongoing advocacy to get some of these things extended into nationwide waivers. We sent on a sign-on letter to USDA last week with over 1,300 people signed on, encouraging them to use their authority to issue these flexibilities. We know that many senators and representatives have been doing the same. So we will keep everybody updated as we learn more, but I think the important thing is definitely to plan for what we know are the opportunities now. So one thing that I would flag is that if you are a school that's planning to do some kind of in-person instruction and you're doing NSLP snacks, switching over to CACFP suppers is really critical. Like I mentioned again in the last slide too, we are hearing differences in the flexibilities around meeting that activity requirement. So checking in with your state to see whether a virtual program would count, whether you could, send home an activity booklet and that would count. So that's definitely something to check in there. And then, just partnering and collaborating to support those programs that are open and operating to get started with meals. And as we learn of more flexibilities and, advocacy opportunities to weigh in on this, we will definitely share that. We know that this is something that has been raised by many partners and we've heard a lot of feedback on, so we will keep everybody updated there. All right, and then on the next slide, before I turn it over to our partners at the Afterschool Alliance, I just wanted to leave with, next steps for getting started if you do have the capacity to operate the programs this year. So like I mentioned, you can operate as a site under an existing sponsor, or you can operate independently as your own sponsor if you are willing to take on that admin role. So I have listed here or linked here the state agencies, and we will make sure that this gets out to everybody too if you are brand new to the programs and want to learn more. So I'm sure folks will have a lot of questions about the waivers and flexibilities, and we will definitely get to those. But in the meantime, I wanted to turn it over to our great partners at the Afterschool Alliance, Eric Peterson, to talk about, what they're seeing around after-school programs, what meals will look like, and how we can support after-school programming on a whole. So Eric, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Clarissa, and thank you to FRAC and our great friends at the YMCA of the USA and Stacy, who'll be up next for all that you're doing. And thanks for taking the time to join the webinar today. For those that aren't aware of the Afterschool Alliance, we're a national organization, but actually celebrating 20th anniversary this year. We're based in DC, but we work with national partners, program providers, education stakeholders, food nutrition groups, and other partners, as well as have about 25,000 programs on the ground as part of our database. We don't directly run programs ourselves. We're more of a network and support for programs. We work with 50 statewide after-school networks and have a network of about 200 local after-school ambassadors who are kind of our eyes and ears on the ground at the local level, and also oversee a VISTA program to provide additional capacity and support at the state and local level. I am looking forward to talking a little bit today about what we've seen after school programs, how they responded. And those of you on the phone who are running programs or are directly supporting and working with programs, just wanted to start with saying a huge thank you for all that you have done since March and before March, but really in the last several months, just amazing work and proud to be associated with this field who has really stepped up and help families and students navigate some really challenging times. So next slide. Here we go. So COVID, quickly, our America After 3 p.m. data, which is for every 4 years, it's a little bit out of date. Actually, we have new data that was collected right before COVID hit, so in February, and those numbers will be released later this year. But in terms of what we knew before, there were about 10.2 million students in programs, but close to 20 million that were wanting to be programs, but unable to due to access issues, to funding and other challenges. Next slide. In addition to the meals, really the value of after-school programs and what we work to support are multiple outcomes. So on the academic side, but also helping young people find their spark, helping with in-school attendance, behavior, options to potential career paths, so many different benefits and outcomes that are a result of after-school programs. This slide specifically speaks to the outcomes from evaluations and research of the 21st Century Community Learning Center, which for those that don't know is the largest federal funding stream devoted to after-school and summer learning programs and before-school programs. It's also been around about 20 years and is housed in the Department of Education. And I'll talk a little bit about that and where that stands now as we move forward. All right, next slide. So I wanted to give an overview of where, Clarissa asked me to kind of talk about where programs have been since March and where they stand now, what we're looking, what we're hearing in terms of trends and activities for the school year as it has already begun in many districts. So we did a survey, actually we did a quick survey right in March, and then we did a larger survey working with Edge Research that was collected May 28th through June 30th, so most of the month of June. It was just done about 900 providers around the country, maybe some of you on the call today that participate in that. So I'm going to go through quickly those results of what we learned of how the field responded. So next survey. The key piece, or sorry, not next survey, next slide, thanks, sorry. The key piece, which is part of our outreach to the Hill and to the public, is that most folks just assumed when schools closed after school program back in March, after school programs shut down as well. In fact, that wasn't the case. About 70% of providers, based on the survey results, continued in some way serving students and families in their communities. The majority of those were in terms of virtual programming, so providing either online assistance that supported and backed up what students were getting from classroom teachers at school, but also in many cases that virtual programming involved activity packets that were delivered or available to parents and families to pick up. In some cases include front porch check-ins where staff would go and check in on families and see how they could support them. About 48%, but right around 50%, continue to deliver meals and snacks to families, often sometimes in partnership with schools, sometimes depending on what the need was in the community on their own. Sometimes that was delivering meals, sometimes that was drive-through or pickup, as many of you know, and many of you took part in the spring and the summer. And then the last one there, connecting families with resources, with community resources. So whether that was rent assistance, whether it was help with eviction, other challenges that families were having, in some cases helping them connect them to testing, particularly back when that was less accessible than now in a lot of communities. The other big piece that is included under connecting families is, so a lot of programs help parents and students figure out the online learning. As you know, it was amazing work by schools to switch basically overnight from in-person to virtual. Some schools were ready for that, some weren't, but parents weren't either. And so helping families find digital devices, helping them find a broadband access, and provide some of those services, connect them with partners who were able to help provide that, either for-profit or private or nonprofit organizations devoted to that piece. And then really, besides the physical part of connecting, a lot of after-school program staff stepped in to help students and really their parents as well navigate all the software of actually connecting with the teachers online and figuring out how their devices could work for online learning, and then the content side of the schoolwork as well. So helping program staff, helping parents help their students with homework assistance and math and science and some of the other projects. So a wide range of supports that programs did all the way through and continue to do now. Next slide. And just a couple examples real quick. We'll go through these quick. So example from North Carolina, providing meals, but also the activity boxes, art and STEM and other pieces, providing resources for families. Next one, from Virginia, another example, and we'll just keep going. Next one, and from Texas, that does meals and activities as well. That was doing a lot of virtual piece, including using texting to stay connected to students and families, again, to make sure that they have the supports they needed. And then I know Stacey will talk about this more, but next slide, many programs, about 18%, continue to be open in person, primarily serving children of essential workers. The Y was a huge leader in this space, as well as other providers, both nonprofit, nationally affiliated providers. Some school districts were able to do this as well, and other provider and some for-profit after-school providers as well. Were able to find spaces, schools or other community sites, in some cases actually in hospitals where a lot of healthcare workers were working to be able to support a wide range of essential workers that continued to have to go to work back in the spring, everywhere from grocery employees to healthcare to local government and other essential workers. And so really providing in-person supports and programming, again, helping with virtual schooling and providing an environment for that to happen, as well as providing social emotional supports and, of course, meals. Next slide. It's just an example from California of one of those programs. And the next one. So the other piece that we found from the survey was obviously programs are really concerned about their students, and we heard this a lot from our school day partners and education and formal in-school education around students sort of dropping off, not tuning into online classes, not responding to teacher support. And so after-school programs often connected with teachers to identify who those families were, and really made an effort to either try to go out physically in person and otherwise to try to figure out what the challenges were for those families and see if they could provide support. But these are some of the big concerns that programs have based on that outreach, that students were, missing out on opportunities for social connections. Learning loss continues to be a huge challenge that we share with the formal education community, and then food insecurity, of course, as well. Next slide. So even with all that amazing work that's gone on, there are huge challenges for the after-school field in terms of being able to continue to provide services. And a big part of that is funding. Despite lots of advocacy to try to find some resources and funding to really support the work of these programs, that continues to be a challenge. There were some successes in the CARES Act and other legislation that passed in the spring and summer at the federal level, as well as in several states, to be able to provide some support, but not dedicated funding. So funding that could be used for after school and summer, but also for other purposes as well. And then really working at the state level to ensure that where it was possible to access those federal funds to support these programs, that actually was the case. We had success in about 18 states and continue to push in those other states as well. But know that there's going to be, especially as we talk about the months ahead, continuing challenges and concern around this area. And then next slide, again, funding is a huge challenge based on the survey for providers, but also better guidance and resources to protect the health and safety of staff, continues to be a huge concern. Programs like the Y and others learned a lot through the spring in programs helping supporting children of essential workers. And then also at summer programs as well, we've learned a lot about what those sort of non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, are that programs have to take in order to support and keep staff, as well as, of course, students and families safe and well, and knowing that all those interventions have to be followed strictly, and if they're not, that's where challenges have occurred. So continuing to make sure that information is safe, and also the equipment, thermometers, face masks. This is actually a picture from a program I believe this one was from Missouri, that used a 3D printer with students to print and make face masks for essential workers in their community. But the need to continue to have those resources and support for staff and students. That being said, next slide, there is a hopeful outlook. 52% of programs are optimistic that things will work out this fall, that they'll have the supports that they need to continue to serve families, and hoping to increase that optimism in the spite of the, as Clarissa said, with USDA, we'll get into this now, lots of policy challenges that are going to have to be addressed, but trying to be optimistic. Next slide, you'll find links to, and we can follow up in the email after the webinar too, but to one-pagers and more findings, as well as PowerPoint slides on the survey results if you want to dive into it deeper, and look, including there's a dashboard that helps you look by state to try to, if you're interested in how your program compares to what other programs we're facing in your state or nationally. And then the next survey is asking for your help really quick, or the next slide rather, asking for your help on a, oops, there we go, on the next round. So our wave 2 of this survey is in the field now, hoping to close it by the end of the month. But that's the really simple URL, number 326.co//survey. If you are a program provider, or if you work with providers, trying to, again, get as many data points as possible on this to get a better sense of what programs ended up doing this summer, and then what they're planning for the fall as we move into the school year. All right, next slide. So this gets into the fun part of what the school year looks like. We spent a little bit of time on this and go through some of this though quickly as well, and happy to do Q&A. Obviously the big questions for the school year coming up, as Clarissa mentioned, many schools, and as you all know, many schools are opening virtually, but it really depends on the part of the country. In terms of what after school programs look like for the fall, we anticipate many continuing to be virtual as they were in the spring, and providing both programming virtually online, but also physical and virtual programs, so kits and things like that, that will continue to be out there to support students and their parents. The big change though that we're seeing for the fall is that really driven by parent demand. Many programs are opening in person when school will be virtual. So what that looks like, there's been a lot of work in this area. It involves key partnerships between the community-based providers and the school district. In some cases, school districts are running the programs, but it's mostly community providers. And they are, where possible, holding programs on school sites. Otherwise, they're in libraries, museums, community centers, programs that have their own sites, like WISE or Boys and Girls Clubs, Parks and Rec are using those sites as well. Typically, the programs are, we're seeing that have already opened and that plan to open are 6 to 10 hours a day. So they are providing for the after school time, but also the virtual school day time. These programs look, and the sort of number one question people say is how, if it's not safe for schools to open, how is it safe for programs to open? A lot of it is the learning experience that was developed from the spring, from programs for essential care workers as well as during the summer. But really the big difference is these are not at the same scale as schools. So most of these programs are a much smaller selection of students that are sort of self-opting in, where parents really are looking for supports and are not able to have students stay home because either they have to work or or don't have family members that can care for students, and for additional reasons want a place on site for their students to participate in their virtual learning, their e-school day, electronic school day. So typically the programs are cohorted or cohorts of students that stay together with the staff the whole day. We're talking 8 to 10 students per one staff member, sometimes fewer or even smaller ratios. They're spread out over the environment, so different sites, so they're not coming in contact with other students. So lots of all the non-pharmaceutical interventions that CDC recommends and other groups have recommended, again, that have worked in the summer, are what these programs are looking like. The actual content of what happens in those programs, it's again, individual students with Chromebooks spaced out doing their online learning, but then the program staff is there to answer questions, to help them with their work. When they're not doing their e-classes, they're often doing other activities to the extent that's possible within the classroom, physical activity, and then of course, the meal piece is a big question. Right now, under USDA guidance, as Clarissa mentioned, it's really hard for those types of sort of in-person programs doing learning during the virtual school day to provide 3 meals. They can really just provide the one after-school meal and snack that a normal after-school program can. And so working through partnerships with schools to be able to provide meals for students is one piece. We've heard of where these programs have started. The parents have to get the meals from the school and then send them with their student to the next day. So there's really a huge need for the flexibility that Chris mentioned from USDA. We continue to have conversations with USDA to be able to make this work in a way that is best for families and children and easiest for the programs and schools to navigate. Next slide. I should say too, on these types of models, there, you may have heard of sort of hubs where parents are getting together and hiring teachers. This is a similar model, but actually very different, and that this is more equity-based. It's available for all students, and looks a little bit different than sort of the hub model. Lots of challenges for these kinds of programs and models, whether you're virtual or in person, as I described. Meals is a big one. They're also more expensive to run, even though there are fewer students. And so the funding piece continues to be critical. Next slide. They do present lots of opportunities. We know lots of students are coming back to this new school year from environments where they've faced trauma over the summer, where loved ones may have passed. And so ensuring that staff have training to be able to work with students is critical to this as well. Next slide. Again, looking at summer as a model, several examples of how programs partnered with schools and others in the community to find additional spaces to schools, and we're able to make different models work. We're going to skip to the next one. This is the next one after there. Yeah, there we go. Let's stay there. So this is actually an example of a virtual program from the spring and into summer that used virtual learning and sort of videos, synchronous and asynchronous learning to support kids from 10 to 4 every day. Next slide. We'll skip that one, go to the next for the interest of time. It's just sort of another model. So in order for this all to work this fall, so these virtual sort of community learning centers, community learning hubs, it takes a lot of partners. It also takes policy flexibility. So you mentioned the challenge with the schools. The big federal funding stream for after school, 21st century community learning centers, is not allowable to be used to fund these types of programs during the school day. And many communities are counting the virtual school day as the school day. And so several states have allowed flexibility on this, but we continue to work with the Federal Department of Education on this piece, as well as with Congress on language for the next COVID relief bill, to be able to ensure that this funding can be used to support these programs as an option, and or also that the 21st century funding can be used for virtual programming during a virtual school day as well, to support students in a supplementary manner to what the school day is providing. Next slide. Similarly, so the Child Care Development Block Grant is another key funding stream for school-age after-school programs. They have provided flexibility. The law there also said that those funds couldn't be used during the school day, but they have, as of August 10th, allowed flexibility for those Child Care Development Block Grant funds to support programs that I described that are serving students in person during a virtual school day. Next slide. We continue to work with Congress on additional funds, so $6.2 billion for 21st century community learning centers. We've had a lot of traction on this. with staff. There's actually a Dear Colleague letter being circulated right now on the House side that will provide the flexibility language I mentioned for 21st century, as well as asking Congress for additional funds to be able to support these types of models, both in person and virtual. Next slide. And I've covered most of these additional considerations of the policy access. The one we haven't mentioned that's on here is broadband support as well. That continues to be a concern for many families and is also driving many families to seek out community partners for their students to go and do learning during the virtual school day. So that continues to be a need as well. And a couple slides with resources and tools. We go to the next one. We have a lot on school reopening on our website, on our COVID page. There's the URL on a variety of tools and sort of a blueprint on statement of support from programs on what this looks like, and as well as access to links to safety guidelines and considerations for folks. Next slide. In terms of resources, the 50 State Afterschool Network, if you're not working with them in your state, please do. And I'm happy to help connect folks to those organizations. They're in all 50 states. And then the last slide I think on here is Lights on After School. Is that right? Which is our celebration of after school every year. We are having it virtual this year, but anticipate it still to be taking place as it did last year in over 10,000 sites around the country. It's essentially a celebration of the value of after school. We have a lot to celebrate this year, overcoming a lot of challenges. And I will leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Eric. I think that just really demonstrates, the link between after school programming and meals and how we really need both of them at the strongest point to make sure that we can expand the program. So a lot of great resources there. I would highly recommend for folks in the call, if you haven't yet connected with the Afterschool Alliance or with the state alliances in your area, to definitely do that as we move forward on this work. All right, so I'm going to quickly turn it over to Stacey McDaniel from the YMCA of the USA to talk about what they are working on and what they're seeing. I do realize that we have about 10 minutes left of this webinar officially, but if we need to stay after a little bit to answer the questions, we can do that. So if you have to hop off, we'll make sure that everybody gets the recording. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Stacey.
Thank you so much, Clarissa. I will make this fast and try to share with you some of what the OYs have done during this time and some of what we're seeing play out with the different models for school in the future. You could go to the next slide. So we have more than 1,300 hunger relief sites throughout the course of the pandemic when those shutdowns started. And of course, Eric's already mentioned our emergency childcare. There were about 1,100 sites that did offer that for those essential workers. We had a lot of learnings, and I'm happy to share a news article as well about some of those early findings where we had kids together. We did not have outbreaks. We really learned a lot during this time and just prepare for this coming school year. So we did feed kids in that emergency childcare, but we also wanted to really broaden that to reach children throughout the community. So we had those grab and go sites. You can see pictured there, the Granite YMCA, Manchester, New Hampshire, and they really worked to complement the schools. The schools were serving breakfast and lunch, and so the YMCA would serve dinner and a snack afterwards, which really worked well. And a lot of our essential workers actually couldn't make it during that lunch hour. So it was a real boon to be able to pick up and have some different options across the community of not only locations to pick up meals, but site times that you could access it as well. The other, you can see the YMCA Center County in Pennsylvania here are those drive-through options. Those were so popular. Even today, we were talking to a Y in Mississippi. She had 500 cars in line at that moment waiting for those meals for those kids. I think what's fascinating to me is during this time, how quickly we had to pivot. YMCAs, are brick and mortar buildings, which were closed during this time. The ones in Michigan are still closed. But we saw the Ys really be able to transition themselves. So we had our membership directors, even lifeguards and aquatic directors switched gears, and they started helping prep meals, serving meals, getting this going throughout the community. What was fascinating to me is we had Ys that saw their numbers increase tenfold. So a YMCA in Monroe, Michigan was serving 100 kids in their after-school program Within a week, they pivoted to serve 1,000 in their community. And that happened with partnerships, volunteers, area restaurants that also helped, right, with meal prep, but also storage space. When you go from 100 to 1,000, you need extensive refrigerated storage space. So we saw so many community partners working together to make that happen throughout this pandemic. And at a time when so many are being laid off, and not going to sugarcoat it, the YMCA did lay off a lot of employees. We have felt the pandemic very intensely, as many of you have, but it was so refreshing to not have to do that across the board, to be able to take staff that wanted to stay active and pivot them into this hunger relief role. And if you've seen our colleagues at the Feeding America, the latest article they had said that hunger right now is 30 million in America, but they fully expect by the end of the year for that to be 54 million. That is tremendous. And it means that it is going to take every single one of us working together to make sure our kids and families have the meals they need. So let's go really quickly. I'm actually going to fast forward through a couple of these slides. So let's go ahead and click forward 2 more slides, if you don't mind. So what's happening with the schools is we know that there are, if you'll just go back one more, is that there really are those 3 kind of options, right? You've got completely virtual, that traditional where the kids are in the classroom, and the hybrid model. So our CECFP providers running those at-risk after-meal programs are really working hard to come up with solutions. That activity waiver for folks that are not running programs, we have seen some states that have approved that virtual programming activity and putting like STEM kits activities in the bag with the meals, but that's not true across the board. So we really are hoping for advocacy for those waivers. But let's go ahead 2 more slides. Perfect. So what we're seeing happen right now is for schools that are doing virtual learning, there is still a huge need for working parents for childcare. The Y has already done this emergency childcare, but what we're seeing happen now is these scholastic support centers, virtual academies, where YMCAs are taking small groups of children, and that is key to this, right? You've got to have extra space and really keeping those small pods of kids together, and they're offering academic support. So parents who are working can send their kids, they have that support, tutors help with that academic virtual learning throughout the day, and incorporate that classic Y activity of fun and physical activities, all while maintaining distance. But this definitely takes a lot of partnerships. We need more space. We need more staff. This is a need unlike we've ever seen before. So there's a couple of solutions. I would ask that you have conversations. I've seen a couple of you are school providers, and God bless you for the work you're doing. I know this has not been an easy year for you either. And, you know, we're just seeing such a need for partnerships and collaborations. How can we all work together to really make sure that we are making sure no matter where kids are, where that learning is taking place, they still have access to the meals. And we can't do it alone. It's taking everyone in the community to make this happen. As it stands right now for those all-day virtual learning support academies, you know, CACFE is not currently providing that option to offer breakfast and lunch. They can only serve dinner and a snack. So those partnerships with schools are key, but also our advocacy. You know, if a school sends home a week's worth of meals for the child while they're there that day, let's say the hybrid option, is the child really going to ration it out themselves or remember to bring it if they're in an all-day learning program? It just makes this so complicated. We would really like that option to be able to have those after-school providers that are providing all-day care, and I know schools as well. How much easier would it be for you to utilize SFSP as you did when the pandemic started and this happened? We really do want to advocate to make this possible. And for our families that don't feel comfortable coming in person to programs, how can we still help them access continuously those meals that they so desperately need during this time, more than any other time in our history since we started tracking hunger? Hunger is at an all-time high. How can we all work together to make sure that kids have meals they need? But not only that, equitable solutions for learning, making sure kids have support. Eric has mentioned so many of the barriers and challenges. How can we work together to make sure that every child has that academic support that they need to succeed in addition to the meals? So I'm going to wrap this up, turn it back over to my colleagues at FRAC. My information is on that next slide. I'm happy to connect with you and also explore partnerships that your YMCAs and your communities can have together with you. We are eager to help support our communities. You can see here, there's a link, the YMCA in Trenton, New Jersey. They were serving 2,700 meals a day in their community and actually sponsoring other YMCAs across the state to help them as well be able to add sites and provide meals. So this is a time when each of you, it's harder than ever, but it's never been more important. So thank you for the work you're doing. And I'm happy to be your colleague and support. And let's do this. Let's roll up our sleeves and feed the kids.
Great. Thanks, Stacy. I kind of wish we could just have you give us a pep talk every morning before we start our work day. Okay, well, we are just at the end of the hour, and I know that we have been getting quite a few questions in, and we have been doing our best to go through and answer those as they're coming in. So I don't think that we need to touch on all of them. A lot of them are very similar. So I wanted to flag that we did put in the chat box the survey that Eric mentioned, and then I also put in an update of the waivers that we know have been extended to date. And I know there are quite a few questions about the extension of summer food through September if school hasn't started yet. So we will send that around. It's not publicly on USDA's website, but I know that it is public information, so we'll make sure that everybody gets that. And then, you know, going back to the point around the enrichment requirement and, you know, what kind of stands in for that, whether it be virtual or take home, you know, I think states are working through the interpretation of that. No state that has submitted a waiver to have that waived has been approved yet. So we don't have a state that has been approved yet, but we do know that states are allowing for different interpretations of that. So we will connect with everybody about what we're seeing across the states and make sure you all have that information. But I think in the meantime, where we would leave you is just to know that we are, you know, like we mentioned, working on the national level and with many partners to have that flexibility, because we think it really is important when we look at the scope of after-school programming right now. But I would also really flag that you should be checking in with your state agency about what they're hearing and what they're learning and how they're thinking about after-school meals moving into the school year, because there is such a range of how this is being interpreted. So if we didn't get to your question, we will make sure we do, and we will make sure that follow-up that I mentioned is shared with everybody. So no need to go to the next slide. We'll go ahead and wrap up today's webinar. We wanted to thank everybody for joining. As always, we have resources on our website. We are really ramping up our COVID-19 updates and resources, so you can feel free to check that out. And then we are actually doing more than monthly webinars. We are usually meeting weekly as this continues on. So feel free to check out our website. And if you have any questions after we wrap, feel free to email me at chayes@frac.org. So we will get that follow-up out. I just wanted to take a quick second to thank you all for joining us today and give a special thanks to Eric and to Stacy for joining us as well. We really appreciate it. So we'll close the webinar here, and we will make sure everybody gets the follow-up, and we hope you can join us for our next webinar. So thanks, everybody.